This evening's workshop is really at a very pivotal point, I think, for you in your journey towards that final element of your 2-year course. You are now, I'm sure, immersed in LCM 05, so you're thinking about how do I take my evidence, and in the light of this evidence, do I formulate and implement policy? Do I make a difference to the children, the students, the adults with whom I work? At the same time, I'm sure you have your sights set on LCM 18, the final module, that final dissertation in which you bring together your research inquiry. And that will be a very beautiful piece of writing, and it will bring together all that you've done. It will be robust, it will be rigorous, and in order for it to be a very credible, or to be a report on a very credible piece of research, you will want to make that really the most polished, the best document you possibly can. So whilst you are working on 5, I'm sure that you are also continuing to collect data, to analyse data, with that final point in view. And so this evening, Professor West-Burnham will help you, advise you, support you, engage you in that sort of reflection and review that leads to that final document. So I'm sure there'll be an opportunity later on in our time together for you to ask questions, and we will aim to end the formal part of the evening at 7:15. So,
thank you very much indeed. Good evening. Are you all well? Good. Only 3 weeks to go, isn't it? Yeah, and then you can collapse for a couple of weeks. Really pleased to work with you on this one, because this is, for me, one of the most important, but also one of the least engaged with areas in terms of writing up research. And I suppose the best way to start thinking it through is that perhaps the greatest sin when it comes to engaging with your data is to describe it. And I can't put it any more bluntly than that. That I've even seen submissions at doctoral level where the major problem was that they were essentially descriptive and narrative, as opposed to analytical. And if there's one thing you take away from this evening, take away the notion that what a good piece of data analysis looks like is essentially a critical perspective that helps the reader understand what you have discovered. And that whilst good, accurate description has a place, in fact, it's not really what we might call master's level thinking or working. The key word, again, analysis, underpinning the analysis, explanation, making sense of. And that I can't stress strongly enough, because you really do lose all of the master level work if you do not engage in this process of detailed, structured review of what it is you've discovered. And therefore what I want to do is to give you an opportunity really to think through where your own work is, think through some of the issues, and I'm going to be focusing in mainly on the qualitative. But some of this will apply directly to the quantitative aspects. But the one thing I just want to say about the quantitative, and it's exactly the same issue, is that the quantitative needs to be based in good statistics, not good arithmetic. Does that make sense? It's not enough simply to organise your information, divide by and find an average, basically. It's got to be done on the basis of the statistical procedures and protocols. And exactly the same applies to the qualitative, just in different guises. So right the way through, it's simply not enough to present the data, however accurately, and you may spend hours finding the appropriate piece of smart art that allows you to put it together in a beautifully coherent diagram, and it's all very wonderful, but what does it mean? So therefore, analysis, definition, and crucially, explanation. And on the handout I've started by saying, look, it's essentially finding, as it says there on line 3 at the top of the page of 1, relationships, priorities, issues and implications, please. That's what this is about. This is when you're creating knowledge. This is when you are helping people engage with and understand things from a new perspective. And that, crucially, you're structuring your work so you can draw valid conclusions which are either a direct response to to the issue that you started with, or they allow you to inform the reader about the way in which this research has enhanced understanding of, pointers in what directions, and so on. Now, there's no one right way. The crucial thing is, what is the purpose of your study? What is it you're trying to do? Is your study an evaluation of a school-based project? That will require one particular type of detailed analysis. Is your study more of a review of alternative perspectives about a particular aspect of school leadership, for example? Is your study exploring teacher perceptions of different approaches to effective pedagogy, etc., etc.? When you have identified, as you did at the outset, what the purpose of your study is, then that will have a significant role to play in determining the structure of your analysis of the data. It's really important, and I think I may have mentioned this when we met previously, that your research questions are the hooks on which you hang everything. And hopefully that if you've been comfortable with the process, you'll have found that the key questions keep recurring, you refine them, you clarify them. And again, what you need to do is to structure your data in such a way that it clearly responds to the questions that you have been working on right the way through. It also needs to take into account the conceptual framework that you developed in exploring the literature. And so it's very important that this is all brought together. This is a synthesizing process above everything else. And all the different elements need to be brought into one coherent, beautifully written piece, which really does give the reader confidence in your control of the data and your ability to relate the conceptual structure to the empirical data. And that's the relationship that we need to work through all the time. And then it's the nature of the project. What has it got to look like? Is it journal-based? Is it a report, etc., etc.? So you put those into the pot, and you begin to say there are certain things which really do need to be dominant in the way in which this data is written up. And then you begin to look at the data you've got. And I've just listed there, the second half of page 1, just how complicated and how challenging it can be with all of these different types of qualitative data, and exactly the same applies to quantitative data as well. And that you really need to be very much in control of what it is you're actually working with and what are the appropriate strategies to do so. Now, I'm not going to go through that list in detail. Hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory. But the issue is that what you're dealing with is very, very complex data. If you think about it, that any kind of qualitative response, even to the most straightforward question, produces multiple layers of meaning, doesn't it? And it's the classic example that I think mentioned before, that you can have a room full of people like this one, you can have one event take place, and you'll get multiple perspectives of it. And that's the challenge we have. How do you secure appropriate data from all that evidence that you have available to you? And some of it in very complicated forms. And therefore you need to be really robust in terms of, this is the sort of data I have generated. And this is the basis on which it was generated. These are the methods I used, and this is what it's produced. And what you have there are a range of alternatives. And all I would suggest to you is really getting through those in a way which allows you to say, these are going to be the key issues in terms of analyzing the data. In other words, what have I got to work on? What are the issues coming from that? Is that coherent? Is that making sense? Yep. So let's take a couple of examples. Let's say you've used a fairly open questionnaire as a sort of survey within a fairly small sample, and that survey has given you certain key highlights which you've then gone on to use as the basis of an interview with, say, 10% of your sample. Yeah. So what sorts of issues, please, are going to emerge in managing those two sorts of data? Have a think about that for a moment. Just think about, on the one hand, questionnaire-based a questionnaire approach, perhaps using Likert scale, perhaps just simply using open-ended questions. But then going from that into interview, what are the organizational issues? What are the issues in terms of managing different types of data, please? Just have a thought about the issues around different types of data and the challenges that they present to you in developing a structure in order to analyze them. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good, thank you for that positive response. Any thoughts, any issues, or are you still recovering from your day and therefore I'll come back to you later? Okay at this stage? The crucial thing is really get your head around what is this, how do I need to manage this? How do I really need to get it structured? And then if you turn on to page 2, you've really got to immerse yourself in this evidence. And I can't stress that strongly enough. My worst case scenario on this was 22 case studies of very effective middle leaders based on 3 days of shadowing of each, with narratives and so on. So there was a pile of paper this high. And you have to work through it and work through it and work through it. And there's no substitute for simply getting it and beginning to work through, and crucially beginning to understand exactly what it is you've got. And I'm afraid there's no shortcuts on this. There's no magic formula. It is simply a matter of really saturating yourself in the data and working it through and beginning to see the crucial themes that are emerging. And you'll do this almost intuitively if you are really on top of your project in the sense of the conceptual framework, the issues and so on. And you'll gradually begin to see patterns emerging. And then the crucial thing is to capture those patterns. But you can only do it really by very systematic, careful and very detailed reading in order to begin to allow your brain to make the connections, basically. There is software available, but I would suggest to you that it's probably the case that the time getting engaged with the software will take longer than it will to actually do the analysis, quite frankly. You're better off in the early days simply working through over and over again, and pivotally, as it says on the first section there, in step 1, it's beginning to identify, halfway down the first paragraph, links and relationships, contradictions and trends. And it may be also saying, that's rubbish. That is marginal. I can safely dispense with that. For example, you'll find that maybe somebody that you interviewed and you didn't pick it up at the time simply didn't grasp the question. And certainly some of the work I've done in the past, you suddenly realize that this person has simply not engaged with at the time, and you were too polite to say it, or you didn't get it organized and so on. So you're beginning to classify. You're saying that's really rich, that's powerful, that's a really mega quote. That one I can effectively ignore. That's a subsidiary, and beginning to say, there's a contradiction here between this section and that section, and really get your head around it in such a way that you begin. It's almost as though you were going to go on Mastermind to answer questions about your data. Can you pick out all the different elements and themes? Whenever some sad person goes on Mastermind to answer questions about a novelist, say, that level of detailed understanding of who said what to who, when and where, that's what you need. And then you're in control. And that control gives you confidence. And that confidence means that you are able to manage and manipulate your data. And it may take you several goes. You may have to work through the schedules, the data, the questionnaires and so on several times until you really begin to find ways that you are confident that you know what's there, and you've been able to develop some kind of fairly robust sense of what is and is not significant, the way things begin to link up, the patterns, and as it says, the various themes and so on. And all the way through, as it says at the bottom paragraph in part 1 there, refer back to your section on methodological issues. Is your evidence valid, reliable and trustworthy? So you really are making links back all the time. Can I use this with confidence? Does it work? And in that way, you really are developing a very, very powerful and almost control of your data, and that's fundamental. All okay on that? Any thoughts, comments? Please do.
Say somebody does a questionnaire and uses a huge statistical sample.
Yeah.
Like a whole of a case stage of a large secondary, of a secondary school, but it doesn't really tell them anything new.
I know.
So the question is, should they dwell on it and talk about it in any depth in their academic paper? Because they might have learned a lot as a researcher,
Yeah.
but they haven't really answered the question that they initially posed.
I know.
So how should they have that discussion?
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, if you didn't quite hear, the notion is what happens when you look at your data and there's not much there. Yeah. And so you've gone to an enormous amount of trouble, but when you look at it, it's probably the case that you maybe haven't asked quite the right questions. It may be that the way you framed your questions means that some people have simply not given you the detail that you need. And I think then you've really got to make the best you can of what you've got and say, is there anything in here which helps me to elucidate what's going on? Or alternatively, and again, it depends upon the particular context of the study, you simply say, I have learnt what not to do.
You actually say that?
Oh, I think so.
Have that discussion?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that can go at the beginning of the data, saying that I've generated this data, but in fact, it's not worked. Because I didn't ask the right questions, and therefore what I can derive from it is this, this, and this. But I did not get the full data, and therefore I've had to change the focus of my report. And I think as long as you're open about it, I'm very comfortable with that. Because this is not just a performance piece, this is learning in action as far as I'm concerned. And therefore it's very important that it's an iterative process in which the researcher is actively engaged in the process of researching as well as generating the outcomes of the research. Yeah? And so, I mean, it's a tragedy. All those wasted hours sort of setting things up and so on. That's why it's so important, and I know this may be the stable door after the horse has gone, that you really do test your research instruments in order to make sure that they will work. And that hopefully you've done that, and therefore you are confident about your data. But if it comes through eventually that there's nothing very much here, then you say that, and then say, and therefore I need to do this, 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 and this. Yeah? Does that make sense for everybody? And I think sometimes you will find people don't understand, people give you ambiguous answers, people sometimes are very uncomfortable in terms of the topic, and so they don't actually engage with it. And as long as you are consciously responding to this and not just tearing it up and throwing it away, but saying, a significant proportion of my respondents of my sample did not engage with this question, which tells me probably that either it was the wrong question, it was badly formulated, or it was an issue within the school that I've not been able to engage with. And as long as you're open about that, I think you're safe. Yep. So the first thing is to really understand, to pick out the issues and the problems and say, crucially, am I safe to proceed with the analysis of this data? And that then allows you to move forward with confidence. And the second stage, I think, is really the pivotal one, which is that you begin to sort. You begin to structure. What did you say your research was concerned with? And pivotally, what sort of structures are you going to need to use in order to answer the questions that you've set, in order to be very clear in the way in which you can demonstrate that you are responding to both the question that you've asked, the conceptual framework that you've set up, and the data that's come in. And that, I think, is at the top of page 3. Let's just go back at the beginning of the section where you are analysing your data. Remind the reader on the purpose of your study and the key research question. What are we doing here, please? What are the key concepts that you've developed which inform your data collection and which will play a significant role in explaining and analysing the significance of your data? What sort of evidence have you collected? And what sort of data have you got? And that allows you then to begin the analysis. But you're not just jumping in the analysis, you're setting it in context, and crucially, you're describing its veracity, credibility, and so on. And then, how are you going to structure it? And this is the big one. And there's no right answer here. And if you get time, then just go through some journals, go through some of the better research-based books, and just look how people have actually structured and organized themselves. And the example that occurred to me when I was coming in on the train is I've spent all today working with a group of head teachers on the strategies in order to move from good to outstanding in Ofsted terms. And I was just thinking through, you know, there were 8 schools there today, and we were talking about 4 key strategies, which are coming through the research base. So there's a very obvious immediate matrix structure there, isn't there? You know, that here's a research project. What works in terms of moving from good to outstanding? Well, here are the 4 strategies, and here are the 8 schools. Let's do the analysis. Very simple indeed. But that really is, you see, that's looking at the notion of question or topic, time or event. What you're saying there is, let's take the topics and the 4 key themes, for example, the whole issue of a values-based school, the issue of trust in the school, the issue of the focus on learning, and the issue of the clarity by which the school structures its working procedures. Those 4 seem to make a difference to schools. How did the different schools use them? How did they respond? That's structuring your data by topic. It may be that you simply use your research questions to structure your data analysis. That's a very powerful way. If you're using mainly interviews or questionnaires, then it may well be that the best way to structure your data discussion is to use the same structure in your data as you did in your collecting that data, using the same pattern as the questionnaire, for example. Although, you need to be really careful that you're making the links, and it's not just a narrative description. And then you can begin, as it says there, organize the evidence by the question to look at all the respondents and their answers in order to identify consistencies and differences. And then you're beginning to analyze. You're beginning to point out that of the 8 schools in the survey, 4 of them use this approach predominantly, 3 of them use that, and 1 used that, but they all reported, etc. And you're into the analysis. And it really is about establishing the links, establishing the networks. And then the second possibility is by looking at particular cases or individuals or groups. So, for example, if you're looking at issues around effective pedagogy in the school, then you may look at a particular department, your own department or a particular team. You may focus it in on a particular individual. You may focus it on a particular group within the school. Again, that depends on how you've collected your data. That depends on the way in which you've structured your research so that you're able to find the natural formation, the natural structuring. That means that you are able to write in a convincing way, but crucially, you're not wasting time trying to find bits. You are, if you like, putting up the skeleton in terms of structure, which allows you then to put on all the other bits and pieces. But you've got to get that basic framework right. Is that okay? Is that nods around the room? Very impressive. So let's take a break from my voice. Just given the main focus of your investigation, given the data that you have, please, what sort of structure strikes you as being most appropriate? What sort of structure strikes you as being most helpful to the reader? What sort of structure is going to maximize your efficiency in applying your data in a way that actually resolves the questions, the problems that you've set yourself? So just share with a neighbour this notion of the best way for me to structure my data is this, and think about the way in which it might work for you best. Okay? So you've essentially got your skeleton. You've got the basic structure. You now know how the different elements are going to relate to each other, and you've been able to clarify the relative significance of the parts. So having decided on that, you can then begin the process, the very complicated process, potentially, of beginning to see how the different elements fit together. and that is in the middle of page 4. And again, the words will change, and there's all. I mean, if you're biologists among you, this is essentially a form of biological classification, isn't it? You know, you can use Linnaean or Darwinian terminologies, but basically you go from different categories as ways of understanding. So, in broad terms, in the middle of page 4, broad topics or patterns, ideas, concepts, behaviours, and so on. That gives you the context. You then translate those topics into different categories that give you greater focus and clarity, and therefore more precision in your language. And then it may be that you need to divide those categories into particular themes. Now, the notion of topics, categories, and themes, it doesn't matter what you call them. But the notion is you're looking at, here's the generic, here's the more specific, and here's the particular. And there's an example of that at the top of page 5, where you're looking at effective pedagogy, and you want to try and elucidate the different factors that seem to be significant in effective teaching strategies in order to support pupil achievement. So the broad topic is effective pedagogy. That's the big theme. And then in this particular example, I've divided that into 2. And the thing is that when I write up my data, I will go back to my literature and say that the most significant variables, according to the most robust evidence in terms of effective pedagogy, are firstly visible learning by John Hattie, and secondly the University of Durham research underpinning the pupil premium. And in both cases, they say that feedback is the most significant variable of all in terms of effective practice, and that closely related to that are cognitive interventions which boost the confidence of young people in thinking, problem solving, and so on. So those are my categories, and then I break those categories down into particular themes in order to elucidate the detail. So, for example, and this, I mean, this isn't right, this is just how I would do it on this particular theme. So, for example, on feedback, I would immediately go to Carol Dweck's work on mindsets, simply because I think it's pretty compelling and it's very, very detailed and useful. But then I've also brought in assessment for learning, particularly the work of Dylan William, because of the ambiguity there is sometimes between feedback, as John Hattie describes it, and the notion of assessment for learning. So therefore I've made that a focus because that's a regular issue in terms of teachers' understanding. But the other one, I'm saying, right, well, cognitive interventions, partly based on philosophy for children, P4C, as a very powerful and well-established intervention, but also the notion, for example, using the work of people like Sternberg and Csikszentmihalyi in terms of cognitive enrichment strategies and so on. Does that help? Can you see the logic there? And when your reader, crucially when your examiner, reads the work, and you don't have to set it out like that at all, but when your actual writing has got that logical infrastructure to it, then people begin to say, this is a person who's in control of the data. This is the person who knows where they're going, and crucially what they're doing is beginning to draw clear correlations. So let's say that your investigation is centered on the notion of teachers' perceptions of the research on effective pedagogy. Now, believe it or not, there are some teachers who deny John Hattie. Now, this is it's a heresy, isn't it? You know, it's one of the great heresies in the history of Western civilization to say that we might question the work of John Hattie. I don't think it's allowed legally still. But actually, maybe the emperor's got no clothes on. And therefore, let's test it. Let's challenge. So let's have a look at what Hattie says about feedback against teacher perceptions and see how they correlate. And suddenly, in that particular area, you're beginning to point out that teachers tend to confuse feedback as per Hattie with assessment for learning as per Dylan William. Yeah. And then then you're into the analysis. Then you're explaining alternative perceptions. Then you're beginning to take control of your data. Does that work? So, have a think, have a conversation, and I'm not suggesting that that diagram's right by any stretch of the imagination, but just use it as a springboard, just for me to say, what does my taxonomy look like in terms of the different factors in my research? And it's I think it's a very powerful way of beginning to impose order, see relationships and so on. And it is essentially a taxonomic activity, seeing how different categories relate to each other. But I'm not going to ask you to do it in detail now, but just say, what are the key themes, what are the big themes, what are the medium, what are the mini? Have a couple of minutes if you're just talking to each other about how you perceive it. Anybody brave? Anybody happy, willing, or prepared to be coerced? Just to, your responses in terms of what you know about your data, please, in terms of the issues that what we've discussed so far raises. Sir, welcome.
We were talking earlier. I've got a lot of data from questionnaires of people who've written word phrases or paragraphs, and I've got a lot of data from pupils' books. And from field notes. And so I was a bit concerned about bias, interpretive bias. So when I'm looking at something, and I've kind of got an idea of what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep it loose at the moment because I don't want to impose my thoughts on it too much. But that was one of my problems. So when I hear interview responses as well, I'm like, where that fits with that.
Right.
Really perhaps doesn't.
Thank you, that's really helpful. The first thing is that the good news is simply acknowledging the existence of interpretive bias is great news. Yeah, and therefore you immediately put your work into a different category of confidence. And I think it goes back to the point that this particular questionnaire didn't work. I'm worried about bias because I'm a participant observer or whatever, and immediately you're reassuring the reader. And then the thing is to say, right, how can I triangulate this best? And then being very systematic in saying, here's one source of data, here's another source of data, here's a third source of data, hopefully, and their relative significance and validity and reliability, trustworthiness is this. So you're immediately giving a very clear and very objective weighting to each of your data sources in such a way as to make it very clear that, for example, looking at students' work is very problematic, isn't it? Simply because of all of the different functions that the people's work serves. So therefore, that's probably low in terms of confidence, but you've designed a very robust questionnaire, and I'm telling you, you have.
Can I quote you?
Yeah, absolutely. And therefore, that is, in terms of the data it generates, higher confidence. And so immediately you're beginning to say, can I find relationships between the questionnaire and the student's work, which is corroborated by my field notes? And then you're building a very robust argument. But the thing is, right the way through, is to what we might call cross-reference, in the sense of, here's something that's emerged from the student's work, and here's an appropriate section of my field notes, which illuminates that point, and then here are 3 comments from the questionnaires which further corroborate it, and therefore I am now justified in drawing this conclusion.
And that's that triangulation.
Absolutely. And I mean, because you've got particular different types of data, then it's easier to do. Sometimes it'll have to be internal triangulation. You know, there's there's a consistent pattern emerging within my questionnaires or interviews, and I can point to the fact that different people are saying much the same thing, but in different ways of different contexts, and that secures confidence, and that's what it's about. That's really useful of you. Thank you for raising that. I'm obliged. Yes, ma'am.
All 3 of my tools are very interpretive, so they're incredibly subjective. So finding triangulation in terms of comparison with my source is difficult. But it's okay to do that through literature, isn't it? So backing that up.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. You see, what you've got to say is that here's the, let's call it the empirical data that you've generated. Here's the evidence that you've brought together. And I think sometimes with that kind of work, that evidence is a better term than data in some respects. And as you know, and I think we mentioned before, evidence covers a whole spectrum of levels of confidence in the court, from the DNA to the circumstantial. And therefore, what you're looking at is to say, here's a piece of evidence which is very subjective, but then look what the literature says, And I can find almost a one-for-one correlation in published research or in a definitive source, which means that my interpretation is validated, and that's a good word to use, by this particular source. And then you build confidence. And all the way through, it's saying, is this just me having a rant, or am I able to demonstrate that my interpretation is based and validated by a range of external sources? Then you build confidence. Thank you again. Anybody else? Suddenly eye contact disappears in the room. It's very strange, isn't it?
I've got one.
Please.
I'm having, well, not problems, but I think ethics is a big thing in mind.
It's big topic, ethics, isn't it? Yeah. Going all the way back to Socrates, it's never been satisfactorily resolved. Sorry.
No, not that far, right? But ethics is a big point, and I don't know how much weight to put on it, because I could spend the majority of this particular module talking about the ethics.
Yes.
Because the topic is hard to reach parents, and there's an awful lot of data out there.
Yeah.
And obviously there's an awful lot of obstacles been put in my way by those very hard to reach parents. And what I'm finding is what you've just hinted at. How do you get away from saying, you know, as a teacher, I can't understand why these parents are engaged.
Yes, yeah.
And to being sort of like too judgmental. And sometimes I think, oh my gosh, you can't say that, Shirley, you're being too judgmental. So it's where to sort of like...
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, the first issue is that, yes, there is an ethical dimension there, but there's also a methodological dimension as well, isn't there? In the sense of, how can I draw valid conclusions about this study of parental engagement? And that's your primary responsibility. Now, presumably, you've got the issue of informed consent as one of the key ethical problems. And as long as there is an explicit commentary on the processes that you've been through, then my own feeling is that you're safe. Because you start by saying, this is not a nice, neat sample that are compliant and engaged. This is a problematic sample, and therefore working with this particular type. And this goes back to the very first point I made this evening, which is, what sort of work am I doing here? And if you've got, and again, it's not exactly fair, but in a court sometimes a witness will be described as a hostile witness. You know, that this person is not to be trusted because they are deliberately and systematically seeking to undermine this case. And therefore, that witness is treated by the court in a different way. It may be that a lot of your evidence has got a different status to that which is given as part of a collaborative professional activity. And therefore, as long as you are recognizing that your evidence has a different status, and you're cautious about the way in which you analyse and draw conclusions, then I think you're absolutely safe. The danger is making broad statements which do not tie in with the limited evidence base that you have. And therefore you may say, this study is effectively compromised, curtailed, inhibited by the very nature of the activity it's engaged in. And that, I think, is totally proper. But the notion is that in your conclusion, you say one of the key issues is that getting reliable evidence in terms of a particular group is very, very challenging, and it may be that we need to find different ways of working, so that your methodology may not have been the most appropriate. It may be that there's a different approach needed with those people. For example, some of the sociology around the gang cultures, for example, that eventually researchers found they had to become members of gangs. It was the only way of getting into the culture, because you could not be a participant observer because you were a threat. And therefore, eventually, you became a member of the gang, which immediately raises moral issues. But you can't become as one of your sample, and therefore, you have to walk a very carefully defined tightrope between, on the one hand, you're looking at the evidence that you have got, but on the other hand, recognizing that it is a complex and very challenging set of data. Yeah? Is that making sense? Yeah, good. Anything else? The doctor is in. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. When do you actually stop collecting? Because as far as I can see, I mean, just in my own research that I've done a pre and post intervention test on mind mapping to support children with Greek literacy, and revealed some very good results for the children with Greek literacy. However, obviously, I could repeat that again and again. But we're teachers, I'm the head of the department, with workload, family, blah, blah, blah. When do you actually say enough is enough? That's my research, that's what I've got. I'm going to draw conclusions from this, obviously interview, to triangulate and use questionnaires. But, you know, I could test that at infinitum, really.
Yeah, of course. And I think, again, it's a valid point, and thank you for raising it. The notion is, and this sounds very, very pragmatic indeed, too pragmatic perhaps, but basically, what's your title? You know, because if you say, I am going to analyse this on a worldwide global scale, then you will go on forever. But if you say, I'm doing a specific focused study of this group over this period of time, and that goes back to page 2, then you define your boundaries. And as long as you define your boundaries and stick to that definition of boundaries, then as long as you are there's internal coherence, then it'll work, it's fine. And I think it's a really helpful point you've made, because the danger is add more, add more, add more. For example, your interviews went really well. You interviewed 5 colleagues on their attitudes towards their teaching being evidence-based. And you really got some very rich data. Well, how many quotes do you need? You know, because you could go on quoting almost indefinitely, couldn't you? Because there's lovely colleagues who are very articulate and they really are giving you insight. But that's when you've got to do the classification and the prioritization and say which of these pieces of evidence from the transcripts really do make my point. Which of all the testing I've done, which really gives me the powerful insight that gives me confidence to draw conclusions. And I think it's one of those issues where eventually you have to say, I am drawing a line now. And as long as it's explicit, it goes back to the title of your piece, and you've set out your boundaries exactly as in the first paragraph on the handout, then you're okay. It's when you don't set out boundaries, have over-ambitious titles, or too constrain a title, then you're in trouble. But if you say, this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm going to do it, then I think you're safe. But thank you. Reassuring or worrying? How are we all, everybody? Reassuring so far? We'll soon put a stop to that. Right, now, there's all sorts of other bits and pieces in here, and I'm not going to go on ad nauseam, but can I just draw your attention to page 6, relationships. One of the joys of reading really good scholarly work, and I suppose the best example available to most of us is the writing of Gerald Grace. You know, Gerald is one of the great scholars, and his use of language is elegant, and his scholarship is profound. And even if you're not doing anything to do with school leadership, as Gerald writes most powerfully on, just read something by Gerald, because that's a model of really sophisticated scholarly writing. And one of the things he does, and people like him do so well, is they draw links. And they link this particular quotation from Teacher B with this statement about effective learning from John Hattie, with this observation on the nature of the effective teacher. And suddenly you've got this wonderful insight that is really lucid, and it really gives the reader a sense that you are in control of this and you understand this. And therefore that, I think, is where the relationships become so powerful. And then there's an example there of mentoring, which I don't think is particularly good. I'll take it out next time. But it's simply looking at causality, isn't it? Looking at relationships, finding relationships, articulating relationships, and saying, are there real linkages here or not? And if there are, let's make the most of them. Let's really make sure that we're establishing it. And crucially, get your money's worth out of your data, your evidence. And that then will really give you the power of confidence in what you've written. I think that's all fairly clear cut. And so then you go into the final step 5. And this is when you make a big value judgment and really say, what is it that I have discovered from my analysis of the data that is significant and important? And this goes back to your purpose in doing this particular project. What have you found that is significant in all sorts of different ways? It doesn't have to be a breakthrough in the understanding of humanity. Okay, although that would be nice, but it's not part of the rules. But if you have got insight, you know, going back to the different issues around effective pedagogy, of saying that, you know, some teachers are really anxious about the issue of feedback in the classroom because of the very real issue of changing the nature of the historical relationship between teacher and learner. That's useful. That's worth capturing. That's worth developing. That's worth linking into other observations upon what it is that gives teachers confidence in terms of their professional effectiveness. That's a very nice insight. And you interpret, you attach meaning to it, you make sense of it, and you begin to draw conclusions. And I suppose the crucial thing here is don't be modest. You know, don't be shy, sorry. Don't be modest, don't be shy. Actually say, I have found this, and this, you know, the evidence tells me that, and my review of the literature combined with my evidence tells me that this is a significant factor in ensuring effective learning or whatever. And you really do need to be very robust indeed in saying, on the basis, and you always are cautious, on the basis of this analysis, this evidence, I am confident in arguing that. Because that's why you've done this, to make it, you know, to make things better. Most of your projects will have a significance in terms of improving the quality of teaching and learning, won't they? If they don't, why are we doing them? And therefore, capture it. And then, crucially, what do we do with it? And what are the implications of this? Where does this take us? What do we really, you know, what do you believe can happen as a result of this? And one way of doing this is simply, very simply, saying self-school system. What does this mean for me? And I think there's, again, a point about how you write your conclusion, isn't there? But I think you say, I have learned. I'm very happy with first person here. Yes?
Yeah, indeed. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah. I think first person is right because you have been a learner in this. And that I have learned that, I just love doing master's degrees and I'm going to do another one. I'm going to go on to do my doctorate. That's good. I'm going to publish an article on this. That's even better. Yeah. Or alternatively, I need to recognize that I have to impose boundaries. You know, and therefore I want to carry on being an active researcher in education, but I will have to work in a different way in school. I want to encourage my colleagues in my team to begin to take on this notion of we are all researchers investigating, so let's begin to explore some action research models across the team. That's a wonderful conclusion to a piece of work like this. So you take it forward, you develop it. Crucially, you say to the reader, going back to where I started, QED. Yeah, that's the important thing. Or alternatively, not quite sure about QED, but very sure that we've got this far. You don't have to solve the problems that you said, because it may be the process didn't allow you to. You know, there's been several occasions when people have started out on a project, they've got well down the road, and then the world changes. You know, and I was doing one piece of research on teacher careers, and I just went into in the days when bookshops actually kept education books in, and I was just browsing the shelves and I saw this book, Teacher Careers and Career Development. I thought, oh, that looks interesting, might be helpful for my research. There it was, all that I was going to do. I didn't know these people were working on it. Falls apart, start again. Yeah. But the point is, it's an iterative process. You develop and learn as long as you're quite focused about that. Okay with that, everybody? Now, you never stop. You're never going to be satisfied with this. But eventually you have to draw a line in the sand. And what I would suggest to you is that pages 8 and 9, I'm not going to go through all these. And again, some of these may not apply to your particular work. But essentially, you need to review your project. it is astonishing how many, even with spell check on your computers, how many things slip through. And it really does. It goes back to the scholarship issue. And if it's appropriate, then if you have to produce an abstract, is it clear? Have you provided an appropriate summary? Is your project, is the purpose explicit? Is your title accurate? That's why I say make the title the last thing you write. And so on down the list. And each one of those is saying basically, is this internally consistent? Is this a logical sequence? Have you covered all the key issues in terms of this piece of writing? And towards the bottom there, the key ideas informing your literature review. What are the concepts, and have you covered them appropriately? What methodological approach do you adopt? And then are your chosen methods logically derived from your purpose and epistemological framework? There's a good question. And so on. What ethical issues have been raised and how have you responded to them? Not how have you solved them, but how have you responded to them? And then, crucially, the bottom of page 8, valid, reliable and trustworthy. And you really need to tell the reader that this project can be trusted because, and then you go through the various elements to demonstrate you are in control of the evidence, you're in control of the analytical process, your conclusions are validly derived, and therefore your piece of work is high confidence. And that's what passes. Yeah? And then, do you integrate, I'm sorry, I should have said this before, the really good analysis of data, well, yes, I think I did mention this basically, but you integrate all the different elements. You know, the different sources of data, of different sources of evidence, you go back to your literature, you begin to draw in inferences and so on from other sources, and basically you make it rich. And, oh, by the way, presentation does make a difference. Yeah, it really does. And you all know this in terms of credibility. You know, so you really need, my advice is always to get a friend who is a very, very, very good friend who will read it through for you and say, you know, although spell checker hasn't picked this up, are you sure about that sentence? You know, is it really clear? And you really go through it scrupulously. That's part of scholarship. That's part of the academic conventions that mean that work is accepted within the academic community. And it's a good discipline anyway, but it's tedious. But that's, again, that's the point, isn't it? You get into the discipline. And please, 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 and again, I think I mentioned this last time, if you have used quotations from the literature, make sure that you know where you got them from. Believe me, because I've done it 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years. You have this lovely little quote, and it has no attribution. And you spend several hours searching through every possible book. And some of you are nodding now, aren't we? Yeah. And you think to yourself, I can either make it up, which is not allowed, or I have to get rid of it, and that's sad. So be meticulous, be scrupulous in attribution. Keep a rolling record of references in order to make sure that you're demonstrating the credibility of what you're looking at. And then finally, what's happened? And that's where you can say, I have learned. That's when, as a result of this research, the school has totally changed its approach to pedagogy, etc., or not. Okay? Coherent? Right. Just have a quick buzz with your neighbours, please. What are the unspoken, non-articulated issues in terms of your writing before we close this session? In other words, what are the real challenges that we still haven't dealt with, please? Is there any other business on this in this area? Just have a couple of minutes and then we'll break. Now, some of the issues may not be able to resolve because they're technical issues, in which case my colleagues will be delighted to answer them on my behalf. That's true. But anything that's not clear, anything that you're uncomfortable with, anything that needs to be sorted. Yes, ma'am.
With the abstract,
yeah.
What, in your opinion, do you think should be included in the abstract? Because some of the ones that I've read from other journals, they say what their question is. They even say their actual results in a sentence or two.
Yep.
They might include their data collection tools. If I did this by doing this. What do you think?
I mean, it depends. Do you have explicit regulations?
No, we don't. We have guidance.
Yeah.
In the academic conventions.
Yeah. I think it's your study in microcosm. I think that usually most universities say around 200, 250 words for an abstract, and certainly the academic journals all say around 200, 250 words. It's a paragraph. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. The purpose of this study was, the methodological approach was, the key findings, and so on. And it's just, I mean, if you go online and you look at any journal, then the abstract gives you an instant flavour. Is this worth looking at? Because they've identified the key themes, the key issues, and it's a courtesy to the reader to say, I now know whether I need to go into this or not. And it's basically a piece of précis writing. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, précis writing was one of the great arts, wasn't it? And it's been lost in society, which is really sad. But I used to enjoy my Monday morning précis. It's often a good way to start the week. But no, again, the best advice is look at some journal articles and see how they've structured, because usually a journal article will go through several iterations before it's published, and one of the areas will be, is this an accurate abstract, and therefore use them as a model. That's the best way to put it. Yes, ma'am.
How important is it for us to generate new knowledge for our projects to be valuable?
The very fact that you're studying a project is new knowledge, right? Because if you think about the number of dissertations being done in education across the world at this very moment, then it runs into thousands, tens of thousands. So, with great respect and affection, ladies and gentlemen, your chances of producing new knowledge are virtually nil. Right? To be totally pragmatic. It's new because you're doing it. That's the thing. Do not imagine you've got to have the breakthrough moment. It's new because you are making sense of an observed phenomenon called practice in your classrooms, practice in your schools. You are applying the literature to it in a particularly distinctive way. You are drawing conclusions. That's new knowledge. Is that reassuring?
Yes, thank you.
Sir?
So how do you code complicated answers from open-ended questions?
Well, serves you right for asking open-ended questions, I say. Sorry. No, glad to be helpful. That's where you've got to get some kind of conceptual framework and say, what are the key words I am looking for here? It does go by basically a fishing exercise in key words. You know, on your computer you can say search for, and it comes up. Well, sometimes you do that, and that's essentially what the qualitative software does. But I mean, sometimes it's just with a highlighter, but you're saying, I'm going to read through this part of questionnaires now, and I'm looking for evidence about teachers' responses to in-house CPD, say. And so you get that focus fixed firmly in your mind, and you go through, and you highlight.
If I'm creating my own keywords, am I not being biased in some way?
No, because your keywords have come from your review of the literature. And you're saying, this is the domain in which I'm working, and this is what established research gives us as a conceptual framework, which I'm now going to apply to my evidence. That's a really helpful point, thank you. The reason you do the literature review is to establish the conceptual framework, which gives you the language to analyse your evidence. That's really important. That, if you take nothing else from this evening, take two things. One is don't ask open questions, and secondly, use the literature as the conceptual frame in order to analyse the evidence you've got. And then you're systematic. You say, right, I'm going to go through and look for this particular issue. And sometimes you'll find really, it's a bit like panning for gold. There are real nuggets, and you give them a gold star. And sometimes they're a really powerful confirmation. Sometimes you'll find one or two of them have virtually nothing in at all. And that allows you then to put them at the bottom of the pile and then continue the search. But it is this iterative process of generating data around your key themes in order to illuminate your analysis. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That's a really helpful point. the front row are very busy tonight.
That's why we came early.
Yeah, of course, together.
My M4 has answered my question, my M4 research. Now for the M6, my main, do I continue sort of observing lessons and carrying on using my tools, my method tools, even though I've answered that question?
That's an interesting one, Mary.
LCM 04 is the interim report,
Yeah.
which was a 6,000 word report submitted in January, wasn't it? So it's interim, it's in the middle of the process by definition. And so you will be, as a result of that, you've probably identified areas that you need to investigate further, or further data you need to collect. And I would suggest that very much an ongoing activity for you now is that continued analysis of the data as well, because as you get further on, you will in that iterative process go back and be looking at some of the data you've already collected. So
I might change my tools.
Yeah.
Well, you might have felt that at the end of module 4, LCM 04, you needed to use another research instrument, research tool, in order to obtain perhaps more data from the same participants, or data from different participants, you know, to have widened your sample. So really that would depend very much on the nature of your inquiry. Yeah. This is the final 10 to 12,000 word report, really, dissertation on the whole project, so it needs to sum up, you know, to reach the conclusion, doesn't it?
So you've answered your question. We'll now reformulate the question in the light of other issues which are emerging, to allow you to increase your understanding of the processes that you've been describing. And so it might be that you look back into your data, it might be that you look more at the literature, you may look at alternative contextual issues and so on. But you've got a really powerful foundation. The issue now is how best to build on it. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think you would possibly, I hope, all agree that I feel that John has answered very, very elegantly the question, how do I give the reader of my dissertation confidence in my research? So I don't know if I've got the right question, but
that's
to me that's where we got to. So thank you very much, as ever. Your wisdom, your experience, your encouragement, I think, is much appreciated. So I invite you to.
Thank you all very much.